There is a scene in Friends that people quote constantly, usually as a punchline, and almost never as the warning sign it actually is. Ross finds out Rachel has been spending time with a male co-worker. Nothing has happened between them, nothing is even close to happening, and Ross still spirals so completely that he ends up at her office at midnight, certain, absolutely certain, that he is about to lose her. Everyone laughs at this scene. It is funny. David Schwimmer plays it beautifully. But watch it again, paying attention not to the comedy, but to the fear underneath it. Because that fear is not really about Rachel. It is something much older than Rachel, and once you see exactly where it actually comes from, you will never watch Ross Geller quite the same way again. Most people watching this show casually, year after year, season after season, simply think of Ross as the neurotic one of the group. The jealous one, the guy who could not let go of a grudge, a girlfriend, or a single argument, no matter how much time had passed. And sure, all of that is true on the surface. But I do not think that is the real story. I think Ross spent his entire adult life terrified of losing things. Somewhere very early on, he learned that he was allowed to have everything, and that belief became the most dangerous thing that ever happened to him. I'm curious what you think before we get into this. Do you see Ross as simply the jealous one, or have you always sensed there was something deeper driving all of it? Let me know down in the comments below. I genuinely, truly want to hear your honest take. Let us start with the house Ross actually grew up in, because it explains almost everything that comes later.
Ross, are you okay? I mean, do you want me to stay?
That'd be good.
From the very beginning, Ross was treated like the family's crown jewel, not just loved, elevated. His parents, Jack and Judy, are warm with both of their children in their own ways. But the warmth is not distributed evenly, and the show never really hides this. Ross becomes a doctor of paleontology, and his mother lights up every single time the word doctor comes out of her mouth. Monica becomes an exceptional chef, and the same mother finds a way to redirect the conversation back to her son within minutes. This is not subtle. The show plays it for laughs constantly, episode after episode, but underneath the joke is a real psychological pattern. There is a specific episode that crystallizes this better than almost any other. Judy discovers that Ross smoked marijuana once in college. Just once, a minor, forgettable thing by any reasonable standard. And her reaction is not anger, it is something closer to devastation. Genuine, heartbroken devastation, as though the discovery has shattered something sacred. Now compare that to how she treats Monica throughout the very same episode. Monica's choices, her relationships, her career, all of it gets met with a kind of low-grade skepticism that never fully lifts. Nothing Monica does seems to land the same way. Nothing Monica does seems to matter quite as much. That contrast is the whole dynamic in miniature. One sibling's minor mistake becomes a crisis worth raising her voice over, because the golden child is not supposed to make mistakes at all. The other sibling's genuine achievements barely register, because the expectations were simply never set that high to begin with. Ross is the golden child. Monica is the child who has to work for everything she gets, and growing up inside that dynamic does something very specific to a person. It does not just shape the child who gets overlooked, it shapes the child who gets chosen too, just in the opposite direction.
Story, he and Monica dated. When they broke up, they couldn't even be in the same room.
If you genuinely enjoy these kinds of deep character breakdowns, the small things most fans completely miss, make sure you go ahead and subscribe. There are many more videos like this one coming, and I think you will genuinely enjoy them. Here is what I mean by that. When a child grows up being told constantly that they are special, that they matter most, that child does not usually grow up confident. Not in the deep, secure way people assume. They grow up anxious, because somewhere inside them is a quiet, terrified question that never quite goes away. What happens if I stop being the favorite? What happens if this thing I have always had simply disappears one day? Ross was never taught how to lose anything, not gracefully, not at all. No, because for most of his childhood, he did not have to. Watch the way the show frames his academic success. Ross is constantly described by his own family as brilliant, gifted, destined for something important, and he absolutely is intelligent. That part is real. But notice how often his intelligence becomes the entire foundation of his identity. Notice how often he brings up his doctorate, unprompted, in conversations that have absolutely nothing to do with paleontology. Notice how genuinely wounded he gets when someone fails to be impressed by it. That is not arrogance in the simple sense most people assume. That is a person who learned very young that being exceptional was the price of being loved at the level he was used to. And once you believe that, on some level, you start needing everyone around you to keep confirming it, forever, without exception. And then there is the dinosaur thing. It gets treated as a quirky character trait for 10 straight seasons.
Plan to get over my man. What's the opposite of man? Jam.
But I think it is one of the most revealing details the writers ever gave him. Ross does not merely just casually like dinosaurs. He has built his entire professional identity around things that existed millions of years before he did. Things that vanished long before anyone could really know them. He spends his career trying to reconstruct the past from fragments, piecing together skeletons, filling in the gaps, trying to understand something whole using only the broken pieces left behind. I do not think that is a coincidence. I think a man who grew up as the center of his family's universe gravitated naturally toward permanence. A man terrified of becoming irrelevant chose a field built entirely around things that last. Bones survive. Bones do not leave. Once something becomes a fossil, it cannot disappoint you by changing its mind. But that is not even the strangest part. The strangest part is what happens the very first time something in Ross's life does not go the way he assumed it would. His marriage to Carol falls apart, and it falls apart in the most public, humiliating way imaginable for someone like Ross. His wife is gay. She leaves him for another woman, and suddenly Ross, the golden child, the gifted one, the one who was always supposed to get what he wanted, is standing in real wreckage, something he had no control over at all. Watch how he handles it.
Maybe you're not always going after the wrong girl.
Not with quiet grief, not with simple sadness, with a kind of disoriented disbelief that follows him for years afterward. He brings up the divorce constantly, sometimes in conversations that have nothing to do with it. He cannot quite process that something this big happened to him without his permission. Because here is the thing about a person who has spent their entire life being the exception. They do not actually know how to be an ordinary person experiencing an ordinary loss. They experience every loss as a kind of personal betrayal by the universe itself. And that is the seed of everything that happens with Rachel. Think about the way Ross falls for Rachel in the very beginning. It is not casual. It is not gradual. He has had feelings for her since high school, feelings he nursed quietly for years. The way a person nurses something they have
I was trying to help out a squirrel.
You were trying to eat it.
already decided they deserve eventually. And when he finally gets her, when Rachel actually chooses him, something shifts immediately in how he treats the relationship. He does not treat it like a wonderful thing that is happening to him. He treats it like a possession he has finally, rightfully acquired. And the moment he feels even slightly unsure of his grip on it, the anxiety becomes enormous, disproportionate, completely out of scale with whatever is actually happening. This is where the jealousy comes from, not insecurity in the ordinary sense. Entitlement curdling into fear, because a person who has always gotten to keep the things that mattered most simply does not have the emotional architecture to handle losing one. Watch him with Julie, the woman he dates after Carol, right as Rachel is finally ready to admit her feelings for him. Ross does not handle that moment like someone choosing between two people he respects. He makes an actual list weighing Rachel against Julie, a physical list of pros and cons, as though Rachel is something to be evaluated and selected rather than a person with her own agency in the matter. Rachel finds the list. It devastates her. And Ross's first instinct is not real accountability. It is bewildered confusion about why this would even bother her. That single moment of confusion is, in many ways, the whole story playing out in perfect miniature.
Hey, don't you want a washboard stomach and rock-hard pec?
Ross genuinely does not understand, in that moment, that other people get to have feelings independent of his own desires. Because for nearly his entire life, what Ross wanted and what Ross got were almost always the same thing. And then there is the break. Most people remember this story as a fight about miscommunication. Rachel says she wants space. Ross interprets that as a full breakup. He sleeps with someone else that same night. Rachel finds out and is devastated. And for the rest of the show, Ross repeats the same 5 words like a legal defense. We were on a break. But watch what is actually happening underneath that defense. Ross is not really arguing about semantics. He is arguing desperately that he should not have to lose anything as a consequence of his own actions. Because losing things was never supposed to be part of his story. Somewhere very deep down, the boy inside Ross still believes something specific. The one who was always told he was special. The one whose mother lit up every time he walked into a room. He genuinely believes the rules that apply to other people should not fully apply to him. That is the contradiction sitting at the center of Ross Geller, a man who is, in many ways, genuinely kind. genuinely loyal to his friends, genuinely capable of real tenderness, and also a man who, the moment something threatens to slip out of his control, becomes someone almost unrecognizable, controlling, possessive, willing to rewrite the facts of an event in real time just to avoid sitting with the discomfort of having lost something fair and square. There is also Bonnie, a relationship most fans barely remember, and that is precisely why it matters so much here. Ross dates Bonnie not long after another breakup with Rachel.
There's nothing wrong with speaking correctly.
During one of the show's many on-again, off-again stretches. And in the middle of that relationship, while still technically involved with Bonnie, Ross kisses Rachel again. He betrays someone who trusted him, almost as if the rules he applies to himself do not apply the same way they apply to everyone around him. This is not framed as a major moral failing by the show. It barely gets mentioned again after the episode ends. But step back from the comedy for a second and look at the pattern building underneath it. Carol leaves him, and he cannot let it go for years. Rachel asks for space, and he immediately moves on to someone else. He hurts Bonnie without much apparent reflection at all. Every single time, the through line is the same. Other people's feelings register to Ross as obstacles to manage rather than realities with the same weight as his own. That is not cruelty in the conventional sense. Ross is rarely deliberately cruel. It is something quieter and, in its own way, sadder. It is what happens when a person spends their entire childhood being treated as the center of the story. Other people's inner lives simply never become fully real to him because he was never required to fully reckon with them. And then I noticed something that nobody really talks about. Look at how many times across the show Ross gets visibly, disproportionately upset over things that to anyone else would barely register. A coworker borrowing his stapler becomes a full-blown confrontation about respect.
When it started, I was just trying to be nice to her because she was my brother's girlfriend.
A minor scheduling mix-up turns into a meltdown about being taken seriously. A woman at his work makes a perfectly reasonable comment about his teaching. He completely loses his composure in front of an entire lecture hall. Each of these moments gets played as comedy, and they are funny. But string them together and a clear pattern emerges. Ross is a man who experiences ordinary friction, the kind every single person deals with constantly, as a genuine threat to his sense of self. Because somewhere underneath the doctorate, underneath the confidence, underneath the constant need to be taken seriously, is a person who never learned something basic. How to simply be one ordinary man among many. He was raised to be the exception, and the world, as it turns out, does not actually run on exceptions. Look closer at his career too, because the pattern repeats there in a way that is almost too perfect. Ross spends years at the museum, increasingly frustrated by colleagues he considers beneath him intellectually, increasingly convinced his own brilliance is being overlooked by people too small-minded to recognize it. When he finally becomes a professor, and the dynamic does not improve. It intensifies. He corrects students constantly, often unnecessarily, often in ways that seem more about reasserting his own authority than actually teaching anyone anything. There is an entire stretch of episodes built around Ross being so easily wounded by ordinary academic disagreement that it becomes genuinely difficult to watch. A colleague disagrees with one of his theories at a conference, a perfectly normal part of academic life. And Ross treats it like a personal assault. He cannot simply hold a differing opinion. He has to win. He has to be right. Because being right, being the smartest person in any given room, has functioned as the foundation of his entire identity since he was a child. This is what happens when intelligence becomes the price of love, rather than simply one part of a whole person. You stop being able to separate being wrong about something small from being unworthy as a person.
How's the hair?
I'm not gonna lie to you, Ross. It doesn't look good.
The two get fused together so early and so thoroughly that by adulthood they feel completely indistinguishable. This is the wound underneath the wound. It is not that Ross was neglected. It is the opposite. Ross was given something that looked from the outside like the best possible childhood. Constant praise, constant attention, constant certainty that he mattered more than almost anyone else in the room. But what that childhood failed to teach him was something every person eventually needs in order to survive adulthood with any grace at all. How to lose, how to be disappointed, how to be one voice among several rather than the center of every conversation. Monica, by contrast, grew up having to fight for scraps of approval that never fully arrived and that taught her resilience, however painfully. Ross grew up never having to fight for anything, and that left him with almost no resilience at all, hidden underneath a confident exterior that fooled almost everyone, including himself. And it is worth pausing here on how the friend group actually responds to Ross over the years. Their patience tells its own quiet story. Chandler, Joey, Phoebe, Monica, even Rachel herself. All of them, time and again, absorb Ross's spirals, his jealousy, his need to be the center of every room. The show frames it as simple friendship. But watch closely and you will notice something else underneath it. They are managing him, gently, lovingly, but constantly. They learn which topics to avoid around him. They learn how to phrase things so he does not spiral. They learn to let him win small arguments that do not actually matter, just to keep the peace in the room. That is not how you treat a peer. That is how you treat someone whose emotional stability depends, in some small but persistent way, on being protected from disappointment. And the fact that his friends do this instinctively tells you something important. The pattern we have been tracing was visible to everyone around him, long before it was ever named out loud. Now look at his marriages. There are 3 of them.
Some water.
Wait, you stole those from these people's wedding?
No, I took them from the hotel lobby.
And the pattern across all 3 is identical, if you know what to look for. Carol leaves because she discovers something true about her own identity, something that has nothing to do with Ross at all. And Ross spends years unable to process that her departure was not a referendum on him. Emily leaves after Ross says Rachel's name at the altar, in front of everyone on what should have been the happiest day of Emily's life. And what is fascinating about that moment is not just the mistake itself, it is what it reveals. Even standing at the altar, vowing himself to one woman, some part of Ross was still circling back to the one loss he had genuinely never made peace with. Rachel was the one thing in his life he had not gotten to keep. And that absence apparently outweighed an entire wedding happening in real time, right in front of him. And then there is the 3rd marriage, the drunken Las Vegas wedding to a woman named Ross can barely remember marrying. And while the show plays this entirely for laughs, there is something almost symbolic about it if you step back. By this point in his life, marriage itself has stopped being about any specific person for Ross. It has become a kind of compulsive attempt to recreate a feeling of permanence he has never actually been able to hold on to. 3 marriages, 3 different women, 3 completely different circumstances, and underneath every single one of them, the exact same fear. The fear of a man who was taught, very young, that he was supposed to get to keep things. A man who has spent his adult life unable to accept the moments when life simply does not work that way. And this brings us to the moment I think is the real emotional center of his entire arc, even though it rarely gets discussed this way. Late in the series, Ross finally gets a version of the life he always thought he deserved. A stable relationship, a genuine partnership, a version of Rachel who chooses him not out of nostalgia or unfinished business, but as a fully formed adult making a fully formed decision. And what is remarkable is how differently Ross behaves in that final stretch compared to everything that came before it. He is calmer, less possessive, less prone to the spiraling jealousy that defined so much of his younger self. Something in him has clearly shifted, slowly, after years of losing things he was never taught how to lose gracefully. Carol, Emily, Rachel more than once. A version of himself he had to let go of entirely. The version who believed the universe owed him a guaranteed happy ending, simply because he had always gotten one before. Watch the difference specifically in how he handles Joey's brief, complicated feelings for Rachel during one of the later seasons. The old Ross, the Ross of the list and the break, and the jealousy over a simple work colleague would have exploded. He would have made it a battle. He would have needed to win.
So if you think that I didn't say goodbye to you because you don't mean as much to me as everybody else,
The Ross we actually see in that storyline is uncomfortable. Certainly, he is not magically free of jealousy, but he manages to step back. He lets Rachel and Joey work through their own feelings without inserting himself as the central character in someone else's emotional process. For a man who spent a decade needing to be the center of every story involving Rachel, that restraint is enormous. The show never makes a big speech out of it. That shift did not happen because Ross suddenly became a different person overnight. It happened because finally, after years of resistance, Ross actually let himself experience loss as something survivable. Not as evidence that the universe had betrayed him, just as something that happens sometimes to ordinary people, the way it happens to everyone else. That is the quietly tragic part of this entire story, the part that nobody talks about nearly enough. Ross was given a childhood that should have made him the most confident, secure person in the entire friend group. Instead, it left him the most fragile. Because confidence built on being told you are special is not actually confidence at all. It is a kind of conditional safety that can be shattered the very first time reality disagrees with the story you were raised inside. Think about what that actually means for a person. Day after day, year after year, every minor setback becomes evidence that something has gone catastrophically wrong. Because nothing in your formative years prepared you for setbacks being a normal part of simply being alive. Every loss becomes personal, becomes a referendum on your worth, rather than the ordinary universal experience it actually is for absolutely everyone. That is who Ross Geller actually was, underneath the catchphrases and the jealousy and the dinosaurs. Underneath the divorces that became running jokes across an entire decade of television. Not simply the neurotic one, not simply the guy who could not let a single argument go. He was a man raised inside a quiet, well-meaning lie, the kind that nobody involved ever intended as harmful. The lie that he was somehow exempt from the ordinary disappointments everyone else eventually has to learn how to carry through life. And spending his entire adult life slowly, painfully discovering that the lie was never actually true. And here is something worth sitting with, because it complicates the picture in a way that I think is actually important. Ross was not a villain. Nothing about this story works if you flatten him into one. He showed up for his friends repeatedly in ways that genuinely mattered. He was a devoted father to Ben, and later to Emma, present in ways many sitcom fathers never bothered to be. He loved deeply, even when that love expressed itself in unhealthy and possessive ways. That complexity is actually the point. Ross is not simply a bad person hiding behind a likable exterior. He is a genuinely good person whose formative years gave him a badly distorted understanding of how love and loss are supposed to work. Those two things, decency and dysfunction, lived inside him simultaneously the entire time. That is exactly why viewers found him both endearing and
So right. When I was holding her, I never wanted to let her go.
deeply frustrating in equal measure. He was not chosen specially by the universe to keep everything he ever loved, forever, without exception. Nobody actually is, no matter how it might feel in childhood. He simply spent the first part of his life being told he was, by people who loved him deeply and who genuinely believed every word of it themselves. They never realized what that constant message might eventually cost their son. And the tragedy here is not really that Ross lost Carol, or lost Rachel for a while, more than once, or said the wrong name out loud at his own wedding. The tragedy is that he had to lose all of those things repeatedly and painfully in front of everyone he cared about, just to finally learn something most people get taught far earlier and far more gently. That you are allowed to be loved without being exceptional. That losing something does not mean you were never worthy of having it. That being one ordinary person among many, rather than the permanent center of the story, is not actually a demotion. It took him 3 marriages, a decade of jealousy, and the genuine heartbreak of nearly everyone closest to him. All of that just to arrive somewhere most people start out understanding instinctively. That love was never something he was owed in the first place. It was something he had to learn, the hard way, how to actually deserve. And somewhere in that long, painful, often genuinely funny journey, watching from the outside, you can see exactly when it finally clicks for him. Not in a single dramatic scene, not in one big speech, but slowly, quietly, across years of small moments where he chooses to let something go instead of fighting to keep it by force. That is the real story, hiding underneath every dinosaur joke and every breakup. Underneath every time the entire room collectively groaned at the words "we were on a break." A boy who was told the world belonged to him, finally learning, the long way, that it never did. And somehow, against everything his childhood had taught him to expect, he chose to stay anyway. He chose to love the people in his life as equals, rather than as proof of his own significance. Think about that for a moment, because I think it reframes the entire 10 years differently than the way most people remember the show. We tend to remember Ross almost entirely through his worst moments, the ones that get clipped and shared and quoted endlessly online. The list, the break, the screaming in the museum, the wrong names spoken out loud at the altar. Those moments are genuinely funny, and they are real, and they fully deserve to be remembered exactly the way they actually happened on screen. But they are not the whole story, even though they get replayed the most. The whole story is a man slowly, painfully, unglamorously learning to want things without needing to possess them. Learning to lose without collapsing. Learning that being loved does not require being the most important person in every room he ever walks into. That is not a small transformation, even if the show never makes a big deal of naming it directly. For someone raised the exact way Ross was raised, that quiet shift might be one of the hardest things a person ever learns to do. That is not the story most people remember when they think of Ross Geller, but once you actually see it clearly all the way through, you will never watch Ross Geller quite the same way again. You will never be able to unsee any of it.